What's up, everybody out there in TV land? I'm actually like extraordinarily busy with work today, but I had a few free minutes between actually writing up some offers. So we thought we'd do a little video here of a league I ran off stream with. This is Dimir splashing green for Tarmogoyfs and some Terra Sunders in the board. I really wanted to keep this splash like as minimal as I possibly could. Uh, but I figured Tarmogoyf was like a really good reason to splash, like an additional proactive threat that can really help turn the corner on like the beatdown plan. But I don't know how it's going to do. It's not something I've tried before, but it's something that I know multiple people have suggested. So this is like the first league, first attempt with this green splash to see how it does. I do think that threat consistency is something that really plagues the Dimir Shadow deck. There's just a significant number of games where like you don't find a threat in the top half of your deck, and that puts a lot of strain on you to be able to play and protect a threat when you do find it and close out the game extraordinarily quickly before your opponent's able to find a second or third removal spell or kind of turn the tide that way. So I really want to see if Tarmogoyf's able to kind of bridge that gap a little bit. Maybe it does, maybe it doesn't, but at least we're going to say we tried. As far as sideboard options like artifacts and enchantments or something that this deck has had a very big problem with. So I'm kind of hoping that Terra Sunder will be a nice flexible answer that can take out everything from Urza's Sagas to Blood Moons. You can kick it to take out opposing mURktides or Planeswalkers or whatever. So it's a really nice, just like catch all answer for any sort of problematic thing that you normally would have to rely on Brazen Borrower or Otawara to kind of interact with. As far as what we cut to include the Goyfs, I cut the fourth copy of mURktide, the fourth copy of Drown in the Lock. What else did I cut? There's a flex Brazen Borrower that I had that got cut in the main deck dress downs. So if I was on 2 dress down and no borrower, I cut the 2 dress down. If I was on 1 dress down, 1 borrower, I cut the borrower and the dress down. As far as the lands, I just swapped around the Fiery Islet and the 4th Watery Grave for 2 Breeding Pool. Again, this green splash is very, very, very minimal. So I really want to kind of reflect that in the mana. We do have 4 Misty, 4 Polluted Delta, 3 Scalding Tarn. They can all get the Breeding Pool. There's not a big requirement for black or green mana. So we should be fine with like our still mostly blue mana base. In the sideboard, I cut the 2 copies of Turok because we cut the 4th Watery Grave. So I didn't want to put a lot of pressure on the mana to need all 3 copies of Watery Grave for Turok, plus a Breeding Pool if we needed to cast Tarmogoyf in the same match. So I cut the 2 Turok for the 2 Terra Sunder, and I think that was the only change there. But anyway, let's just go ahead and jump into the matches, see how it goes, and then we can go over some feedback afterwards, see what we thought. And bam. All right, so match number 1, we do win the die roll. Really love to see it. Opening hand is okay. We've got a redraw. We've got a Thoughtseize, some interaction. We've got a threat. We see our opponent's on some kind of like an Artifact Matters red deck. We see Chromatic Star. We see Gleeful Demolition. Decided to take the Demolition because I have the Fatal Push to answer the Dragon's Rage Channeler. Of course, their next 2 blind draws are Third Path Iconoclast and a Mishra's Bauble to make a token. But at least we have the Iconoclast answered. So, step 1. 1 token's not the scariest thing in the world. Bunch more threats. If you haven't played this Dimir list before, or in this case, this Sultai list, we are very, very weak to aggressive creature strategies. We just don't have a lot of cheap interaction. So our opponent top decking like 3 straight threats and 4 draws is really, really awkward for us. Fortunately, this Dragon's Rage Channeler having to attack means we are able to kind of leverage this mURktide here standing in front of something. I want to take out the Sprite Dragon because one, I know the Channeler is going to have to attack into the mURktide next turn anyway. Two, if I decide to attack an Archmage's Charm, I can steal the Dragon's Rage Channeler. Usually these decks with like the red base burn stuff and Sprite Dragons and in this case Iconoclast or whatever, they're not really on counter magic. They want everything to be very proactive. So I'm not too worried about like spell pierce here. So when my opponent goes for like another Iconoclast, enters combat, we can just steal the Channeler, trade off with this token. And now we've just got like the big thing on board. Another Iconoclast is good. Shadow's fine. Opponent top decks a Sprite Dragon. They don't really have a good attack because we just kill them on the crackback. So instead, we get to force a double block here and then fetch and put down mURktide. I could stay at 4 and just not play the mURktide, but like I'm dead to bolt either way. So I would rather be dead to bolt with another threat on board and be able to beat like another hasty threat or something, as opposed to like be dead to bolt and just not doing anything. So on to game 2, sideboarding, just boarding out like some Street Wraiths and Thought Seizes, since our opponent's like an aggressive red deck. And boarding in, I think, what did I board in? The magic of rewinding slightly. Board in Stub, Fluster, Dress Down. So I boarded in the extra Fatal Push, the Shieldred's Edict, the Engineered Explosives, Unlicensed Hearse, Chalice of the Void. They're just a very one-drop centric deck, so Chalice seemed fine. Get a lead off on a Thoughtseize. We see that they do have a Synthesizer, but Iconoclast is their only current threat, so we'll just take that off the board. Now we're just hoping to find lands, which we do. Lethal Demolition, their Synthesizer. Find a Channeler. So like our biggest problem is going to be if we don't find lands. So Otawara, really nice pickup. Now we can just hold up Drown in the Lock, or we can Shieldred's Edict. And since we have the ability to specify that we want them to sacrifice a non-token creature, we could just like guarantee the hit on Channeler. But I really want this Channeler and tokens to hit me once so I can enable my shadows. We know that one of their blind cards is Unholy Heat. So I play out 2 shadows here. So if my opponent goes for an Unholy Heat, I can fetch and shock. If they did go for, or if I did fetch and shock first to play out another shadow, then they could just like attack with the Channeler. I'm dead to bolt. I don't really want to put myself in that position. So this kind of makes them have to make the first move if they're going to go for Unholy Heat. In which case, I could respond with like Fetch, Shock, Shieldred's Edict to sack the Dragon's Rage Channeler. But they've got an Underworld Breach, so we're just going to get that out of here. Attack him with their Channeler. So we're down to 6. Our shadows have now outgrown Unholy Heat. We know their 2 blind cards, or their 2 cards are Heat and Gigantha. Stubborn Denial, really good pickup. Get to force a chump block, get down another shadow. We have Shieldred's Edict to sack this Dragon's Rage Channeler so they can't hit us for any more. And they decided to just go for Gigantha. So our best draw is some way to lower our life total to force triple chump block. And that's exactly what we do. So now they have to block across the board. We don't care if they Unholy Heat our last shadow here because we just have Stubborn Denial and Lethal on board. We shouldn't be theoretically dead to anything. So, yeah. Match 1 in the books. So this is match number 2. Opponent leads on a Yawgmoth, so Yawgmoth. Our hand is not particularly good against Yawgmoth. We don't have a lot of pressure at getting down a mURktide quickly, nor do we have much to get a Shadow down. We don't even have like a hard counterspell for Grist. So, really unfortunate start to this one. Just kind of uh, what's the word for it? Amplified by the fact that our opponent doesn't have any sort of fetches going on here. So Drown in the Lock's dead. Assume this is going to be a Grist. Yep. They could kill the Shadow, but instead decide to make an insect token. Maybe I should have played out the Shadow and the mURktide last turn. I think that would have forced the Grist activation on the mURktide, and like maybe I could find a way to get through with the Shadow, but likelihood's very, very low. Now we've got a little bit of a storm going on here. Like Blood Artist is very easily going to seal the deal here. Because now they get to drain life just by killing off my mURktide and go around us pretty wide. Sideboarding against Yawgmoth, I'm usually bringing in like Unlicensed Hearse, Dress Down, boarding out some number of like Stubborn Denial, Street Wraith, Drown in the Lock. I think in this case I left in Drown in the Lock because I just didn't have more stuff I wanted to board out. We could go for Dismember on the Hierarch, but I'm going to Fatal Push instead because I know I can get down the Goyf on turn 2. And if I go for the Dismember, then I might not have Revolt later to take out something bigger. So, little conservative, but whatevs. We'll Dismember Wall of Roots, really hoping they didn't have Veil of Summer there. We got a little fortunate. But with the opponent missing their land drop, we can see that like killing off that Wall of Roots was the right choice. Play Hearse pre-combat, so if they block with the Young Wolf, I can eat it with the Undying trigger on the stack. If they don't block, then I just get to play out my other Tarmogoyf and say, yeah, we're going to try to go on the beatdown plan. Looks like opponent's not here for it, so on to game 3. Grist is obviously like an absolute nightmare card for us to deal with. So anytime you do have a chance to like stop a Grist, I would pretty actively take that route. So like, for example, here, Strangleroot Geist is really annoying, but I kind of just have to take hits from it for a minute to make sure that I'm not leaving myself just dead to a hard cast Grist on turn 3. Like so. But we do get to answer that. And like the Strangleroot Geist isn't exactly killing us too fast. So we've got a bunch of turns to find like a threat. Unfortunately, our Street Wraiths just find more Wraiths and lands. So this is a good example of you can have a theory like, hey, I want to add Tarmogoyfs into my deck to improve my threat density. And sometimes that theory just doesn't work out. Like you could play 19 threats and still just have games where you don't see them. And there's not really anything you can do about that. It just happens. So they cord for Blood Artist. Yeah. So at any point, I was either dead to them attacking or dead to them cording for Blood Artist. On to match number 3. Opening hand only had 1 land, basic island, so got to ship that back. Second hand has 1 land as well, but at least it's one that can get like our Watery Grave. So a little more flexibility. Finding the second land is nice. Up against Living In, so like hopefully Stub and Drown in the Lock can stop Living In. So I didn't want to fetch here because I wanted to increase the number of potential land draws I could get to. But I was kind of hoping that if I did fetch, my opponent would think, oh, he's tapped off a counter spell. Let me go for a violent outburst now, and I could stubborn denial it. But they ended up not going for it. So we just kind of draw, pass again, which in hindsight, it probably makes sense that they didn't go for it. Because, I mean, all they would have gotten is a curator and an architects. And I could very easily just let that go, like fatal push the curator and architects turns on my shadow. I still have 2 counter spells. So to a point, I get it. But instead, we just have to deal with like violent outburst plus force negation into forces to tap out, untap. I guess still on our turn. Get down shadow, pass the turn, untap, and I think they go like cycle into a cascade spell. Yeah. So we got to just scoop to that. Just a case of like not finding the right half of our interaction. We found some counter spells, but we didn't find like the draw spells and stuff to get our threats online, and we didn't find enough counters. We found like a bunch of fatal pushes and stuff, and that's just not good in that matchup. So Thoughtseize, we see Force Negation, couple cyclers, take the Force to try to protect our counter magic. So now they really need to draw like both cascade spells and interaction to stop us from interacting with them. So see what we can find. I really want them to not go for a cascade spell this turn so I can Archmage's Charm, but I'm not going to Archmage's Charm into just like 3 open mana. Now, if they had done like this in past, like had Forest, Sunken Ruins, Otawara past, then I would go for Archmage's Charm since they couldn't Violent Outburst, but clearly that was not the case. And sort of like the Yawgmoth game, it's just one of those games where you see a bunch of lands, you see a decent bit of interaction, but you just don't find any way of getting pressure on your opponent. And ultimately, that's normally going to be enough to like wrap things up. Pretty okay scooping there because our best draw is a threat, and a threat doesn't survive our opponent just attacking twice. All right, on to match number 3, 4, can't remember, something. I think it's 3. But we have a very, very interesting hand. So whenever people ask about like cycling or not cycling early, um, or like being in the dark with how low you want to go with your life total aggressively, I try to make these comments about it depends. Like, what does the context of your hand look like? Uh, if you don't have a shadow in hand, I wouldn't advise taking a bunch of unnecessary damage. If you can't like get down the shadow and protect the shadow, then I wouldn't recommend it. If you don't have like Thoughtseize to see what's going on, I wouldn't recommend it. So in a hand like this, we have the ability to cycle Wraith a couple times. If we do happen to find that fetch land or that watery grave to Thoughtseize, now we've got turn 1 Thoughtseize, turn 2 Shadow plus Consider, turn 3 counter spell to protect the shadow, and just like a very, very quick clock with that. So that's why I'm a lot more proactive with this hand, is because like I have a good chance of that curve out of Thoughtseize into shadow into protect the shadow, and that can win just a lot of games of Magic. So of course, when you see a start like this, you get a little concerned of like, oh, I just cycled Wraith twice, I fetched and shocked, I Thoughtseize, I'm at 11 life, and my opponent's on burn. Dang. So take a Swift Spear because I don't have an answer to that, and I don't want my shadow chump blocking. I kind of expected them to go for the Searing Blaze here on their main phase. They didn't. So I'm just going to like fetch and try to bait the Searing Blaze. Like, hey, if you just want to go ahead and resolve that now, cool. If you want to fire off one of your other burn spells, cool. Whatever the case may be. Like, if you fire off one on your turn, that speeds up my clock without me having to do anything. I still got 2 counter spells. If you don't fire it off, then you're going to be spending like your next turn, and I save life and I still have counter spells. So either way is pretty favorable for me. And I know I'm going to get questions about this. Yes, I know that Searing Blaze does not kill my shadow. I am well aware of this interaction, I promise you. But my opponent getting basic mountain here when they have Boros Charm in hand leads me to believe that they have another land in hand. Like, Boros Charm's a great card. You want access to it. You wouldn't just like strand it in your hand in a matchup where life total matters so much. So I think they've got another land. If I let this go, I go down to 7 life. I'm dead to like Boros Charm plus a burn spell. But there's no guarantee that my opponent's going to cast anything on their turn. And I think that's the big kicker here. Like, if I could guarantee they were going to do something and I could convert on counterspell next turn, then I would just let this go, pass the turn, let them cast their thing, and I counter it. But if I want to be mana efficient, I need to make sure I'm converting on a counterspell this turn cycle. Because if not, they can just go to their turn, pass back to me, and now my only way to convert on multiple counterspells is with this fetch that puts me down to 9 life. Now I'm dead to 3 non-Boros Charm burn spells instead of 3 spells that have to include Boros Charm. So, with all that said, we're just going to go ahead and convert on a counterspell to make sure we are not losing access to our mana. And just as assumed, our opponent suspends a Rift Bolt and passes and does not go for a Boros Charm. So we would have ended up wasting that mana that turn by not getting to counter anything. So now they're down to Skullcrack, Boros Charm, a Rift Bolt on Suspend. They cast the Boros Charm, we get to convert on our second counter spell. Now we have the fetch land up in case they go for one of our shadows with Rift Bolt, but otherwise they need to have 2 burn spells in hand that total 7 damage. So they would have to have Boros Charm and another 1 mana burn spell. We know that they have a Skullcrack in hand. So their other 2 cards have to be exactly Boros Charm, 1 mana, 3 damage spell. And they do not have it. So we get to go to game number 2. So just goes to show that you can win a match against a deck like Burn by going Wraith, Fetch Shock, Thoughtseize on turn 1 if you can recognize when that play pattern is acceptable. So even the worst potential matchup you could see with that start, you can still get there if you play smart about it. Have a reason to fetch and shock. Don't just like fetch and shock for the sake of fetching and shocking. Just going to convert on some sort of a counter spell here. Get down our shadow. Opponent was like pretty adamant about bolting our face last game. This one, I don't know if I love so much. Like, I really like converting on the counter magic last game. This one, I'm a lot iffier about. Mainly because if I do let this Searing Blaze resolve, like, I just put my opponent in like 2-turn clock territory with double counterspell backup. And yeah, I decided to counter it and they bolt my shadow. And I don't know. just not as sold on that one as I feel like I should be. But opponent having a card in hand and not doing anything means their last card is probably something that like matters or cares about me having a threat. So maybe like Path to Exile, Searing Blaze, um, Deflecting Palm, something like that. But thankfully, we find another shadow, so all is temporarily okay with the world. I do not want to fetch down to 6 if I can avoid it. I'd rather like force them to have a Boros charm than just give them free free damage here. So now they decide to double Searing Blaze my shadow. So I've got Shieldred's Edict for a threat. I've got Counterspell for a non-threat. They've got 2 draws. And they go for a hard cast something, and we go for a Counterspell, and they are dead. Nice. On to match number 4, 5. I think this might be match 5, actually. Again, we have like a aggressive Wraith into Thoughtseize into Shadow Opener. But our opponent's on the play leading with a Channeler, so I want to be like a little more conservative with my Wraith play. And this is like the difference between being on the play with this hand and being on the draw with this hand. Like being on the play, you're a lot more likely to go, hey, Wraith for information, fetch shock, Thoughtseize, take your aggressive 1-drop, and then turn 2, play down a shadow, start playing the tempo game. But on the draw, my opponent's already got a threat down. I don't really need to like be too hyper aggressive with my life total anymore. And this is kind of a series of play pattern I'm trying to get better about against mURktide. They do have like Lightning Bolt and Unholy Heat and stuff that can deal with shadows. I've got the Street Wraith to dodge the bolt and maybe kill on the crackback if they try to get too aggressive. But I'm just trying to get better about like being aggressive in the matchup and not trying to play the control game, because ultimately like they're a deck full of red based removal, and shadow typically can kind of prey on red based removal. I could fetch shock, cycle Wraith, but that's still not lethal. So instead we'll just let our opponent cast spells. If we Archmage's Charm the Dragon's Rage Channeler, then we can, in fact, turn on Delirium with the Charm. So we would get a 3/3 Channeler. What was I going to say here? Opponent bolted us. They are potentially turning on Delirium with this iteration, which I believe they do. Play. Yeah, they flip over a Shredder. So they have Delirium. I'm not dead to the attack with these two. If they attack with, this is where it becomes important to like put the pressure on your opponent. So they've got 3 cards in hand. They've got a Ragavan and Exile to the expressive iteration, 1 land available. I'm not dead to this current attack. I'm not dead to this attack plus bolt. I am dead to this attack plus bolt and spell pierce, but one step at a time regardless. They play a tap land, so I know they can't have double spell here. I definitely messed this up, so this is a good like hindsight learning moment. I should have gone for Drown in the Lock on the Ledger Shredder, because if they've already played a land. If like not fetch, Drown in the Lock on the Ledger Shredder, because if they had Spell Pierce, then they would have to cast it, tap themselves out, even if they discarded a live spell to Ledger Shredder, they still have to attack with a Channeler. I've got 2 lethal shadows on the crackback. They've got 1 blocker. Um, and I actually gave them an out here by going for this Archmage's Charm to steal the Channeler. Uh, yeah, this is just like bad all around. Because even if they let the Drowning Lock resolve, they could play the Ragavan from exile. They'd still have to attack. I'd still have 2 lethal shadows. So yeah, I went from like 100% win rate to giving them an out of spell pierce. And again, even if they had like spell snare and countered the drown, they would still be dead because they're forced to attack with channeler, and I kill them on the crackback. And they don't have enough to kill me with the channeler and the shredder. So bad play on my part. Didn't get punished. Game 2 against mURktide, we've got like quick Thoughtseize, take an iteration, their best grind card. Hope they don't find a second land right away, but if they do, they're likely to play Shredder plus Bobble, in which case I can just get down to Tarmogoyf. And as we assumed, Shredder Bobble, ditch a land. So we know they've got Spell Snare, Unknown, drawing 2 more unknowns. We get down Goyf because our Goyf is going to clock a lot faster than their Shredder, especially if they're not ditching live spells. EE on 2 is kind of an interesting play. Kind of them recognizing that, hey, I can't outrace your Tarmogoyf, so I'm okay just blowing up my own Ledger Shredder to kill your Tarmogoyf. Then they've got this Dash Ragavan here. Since I've got Stubborn Denial, I can pretty well afford to like kill the Ragavan, take the hit, and now I've just got, if I find one way to lose life, a lethal attack on the way back. Speak of the devil. So now I've got a lethal attack with double counter spell, and yeah, nice. Nice. All right, so let's talk about how the list performed. We did see losses against Yawgmoth and Living End, where the predominant reason was we couldn't find a threat. And even with cutting 1 mURktide and adding 4 Tarmogoyf, that was still a very relevant issue. One thing I think I'm going to try out of curiosity is getting rid of the green splash, but replacing these 4 Tarmogoyf spots straight up with like 4 opt or something. Just more 1 mana cantrips that help us find mURktide, find Shadow, something like that. Find counter spells after the fact, and see how that plays out. Kind of make it more of a blue black Xerox style Shadow deck, and see if that has like any merit to it whatsoever. Probably drop it down to 19 lands, go back up to 4 mURktide, 4 Shadow, 4 Wraith. The sideboard, Terrace Under, I don't think we really saw in any relevant matchups. Doesn't mean it was bad, just didn't see the artifact enchantment stuff that we normally struggle with. The Turoks weren't necessarily missed, but at the same time, Turok is like still a body in matchups against like Living End. You just need bodies. So maybe a little missed, not a ton. Hearst looked fine. The extra removal spells out of the sideboard continue to look decent. Yeah, not much to say. Like, just losing games because you don't see the threats that you need, and that's kind of the MO of this deck in the long run. Is your threat consistency is one of, if not the biggest inhibiting factor. So if that's a concern of yours, if you're not okay losing threat or losing games to threat density, then maybe like a shredder build is better for you. I also thought about going shredder, Goyf, Shadow, plus like mURktide or something, and seeing how that did. Uh, but that's like way, way in on the threat side and way off of the counter side. So I just have to see if that's something I'd potentially be interested in trying in the future. Don't have any sort of list brewed up of that. But yeah, hopefully you enjoyed checking out the Green Splash. As always, if you're liking the content or the commentary, feel free to leave a like on the video or drop a subscription on the YouTube channel. Greatly helps. Otherwise, hope to catch y'all on the next video. Adios for now.